Hello friends, and welcome back to Dungeon Design in Zelda. Last time we examined the introduction and tutorial dungeon of A Link to the Past, Hyrule Castle, so go check that video out if you haven't already. Since that's done, this time we're jumping into the game's first proper full-length dungeon, but as usual there's a few pre-dungeon things to get out of the way first. After leaving the sanctuary, there's a little bit more story setup to do before we reach the dungeon itself, but nothing that should take too long to do. There's a handful of secrets to find, including a few heart pieces, but as far as mandatory stuff goes, the list isn't too long. Zelda herself suggests that in order to defeat Aghanim, we'll need to find the Master Sword, and so she sends us to speak with Sahasrahla, the village elder of Kakariko, in order to learn of its whereabouts. As it turns out, when we get to his house, we do indeed get to learn about the Master Sword, but Sahasrahla himself is not around. But we can explore the village to find more info. While here, it's worth getting the 2 bottles that are obtainable here, as well as bombs and the net. Otherwise, this kid marks Sahasrahla's location on our map, located east of Hyrule Castle. We can head over there, get some exposition from Sahasrahla, and he'll ask us to go to the nearby Eastern Palace to find the Pendant of Courage, promising us a reward after that. It's just a short walk over to the dungeon itself, though there's a fair amount of baddies to fight here, including these Armos. Nothing too difficult though, so with all of that out of the way, we may as well get right into it. Let's head into the dungeon. Welcome to the Eastern Palace, the first proper full-length dungeon of A Link to the Past, and I gotta appreciate the level design here. The palace offers a nice balance of an open, explorable area and then combat gauntlet approaching the boss fight. While this structure is basically a carryover from Hyrule Castle, it's actually done a bit better here in my opinion. It's essentially iterated upon and improved over the last dungeon with some added challenge. Since the game has already given us its tutorial dungeon, it can now put what we've learned to the test, but without the difficulty spiking too suddenly. This is still the first full-length dungeon after all. Still though, the Eastern Palace features overall tougher enemies than those found in the castle, and a greater variety of them too. From Stalfos who actually dodge and avoid your attacks, armored and imposing Igors, fire fairies who can't be killed whatsoever, these sea enemies, they are called Popo, and there are a variety of traps and obstacles to keep you on your toes. The architecture here is nothing spectacular to note, but I do find it interesting that the place has a handful of Igor statues, almost like foreshadowing of the enemies being scattered ahead. While the origin of the Eastern Palace is not very well explored in this game, the fact that the Pendant of Courage is found here, in addition to the exposition given to us by Sahasrahla afterwards, my headcanon has always been that this place is some sort of fort or garrison the Knights of Hyrule that Sahasrahla talks about may have used as a base of operations. Not unlike the Akala Citadel in Breath of the Wild, its placement on the map would have made it a good stronghold for defending the kingdom. Sahasrahla also states that the knights were the guardians of the Pendant of Courage, which is found in the very depths of the dungeon. There isn't really much more to go on here in terms of architecture or iconography, but that's just always felt like the implications to me. The music of this dungeon is also a piece I have such nostalgia for. The game's soundtrack titles it Lost Ancient Ruins, and the song has such a palpable feeling of mystery and danger. There's this constant ramping tension that rises and falls. I love it. The dungeon navigation here is surprisingly stellar. It's a pretty short dungeon, taking me only about 10 minutes to breeze through casually, so maybe I've never really taken note on just how well designed it really is. But playing it again while taking notes for this video has really opened my eyes to just how well this dungeon plays. There's a handful of optional rooms with secrets, such as cache, as well as a fairy fountain hidden off the central room, so even though the dungeon already offers a fair balance for combat challenges, while not overwhelmingly difficult, between hearts being plentiful to find and the fairy fountain being at the very center of the dungeon, where it's always easily accessible, the game is essentially inching the challenge up for players while still being very forgiving. And this early on in the game, that just makes a lot of sense. I mentioned it already, but it really does have that perfect balance of linearity and openness here. I mean, the sequence of events here is still technically very linear. You have one critical path to follow, but it gives you space to move about, hit dead ends, and explore some more. We can see that right from the start, albeit at a very small scale. When we enter the dungeon, right here in the foyer, there are 3 doors we can choose from. Both of the side doors are immediate drops into a bottomless pit, so while the center door is the only way to actually go, it still makes things feel a bit more open and explorable than it actually is. That center door is also locked, with a switch to open it hidden under this pot. Every one of these pots we've found up until now has actually been entirely optional. In fact, there's a chance that this could be the room in which players discover they can even interact with these, so the developers locking the door until you figure that out is important here. The solution seems painfully obvious to us experienced players, but keep in mind that objects that you could lift and throw did not exist in the first 2 Zelda games. It just wasn't a thing until now. Even in Zelda 1, you could only place but not throw bombs. So they essentially lock you in here until you figure out and learn this mechanic, and it will come up again later. The next room features some minor enemies and another floor switch that opens the door, but this one is slightly less obvious. It blends in with the floor somewhat. Nothing too challenging. The sense of danger gets amped up a bit more in the next room, where we're forced to avoid this infinite barrage of orbs, and we're confronted by our first proper fork in the road. This path snakes around the room and rewards us with some optional treasure, again reinforcing for us that exploring is good and will be rewarded. In fact, that treasure is visible and teased to us right when we first enter the room. The other path takes us into the dungeon's central room, and man, I love this room. It's iconic and visually striking, which is important, by the way, since it works to incentivize and tease us a little bit. We're initially limited to this upper balcony, but we can see a big treasure chest in the center of the room that we can't yet reach. The player's curiosity is tickled here. We naturally want to figure out how to get down there to see what's in store for us. We also get our next fork in the road here. Heading right takes us down this path, which loops nicely back on itself, where we'll find the dungeon map. The left path takes us to the compass, which we did not find in the castle, but returns here again from Zelda 1, showing us where the end goal is. And then it's downstairs to the lower part of the central room. Just a note before we get there, but I love that while exploring here, we can always see other parts of the dungeon. There is overall just a great sense of interconnectivity about this place, much like the praises I had for Dodongo's Cavern back in the day, with the bridges and paths that overlap the rooms here. It just makes the place feel more real and connected, and visually way more distinct than the samey room designs of the first 2 games. It also, like the big chest example in the central room, constantly tickles that player curiosity, because we can see that there is more room to explore just out of reach. We can see in both of these rooms that there is a lower section below us that we'll need to tread through later, and then these blocks form a one-way path, blocking us, teasing us that there's something there. So it makes the dungeon feel both cohesive and visually interesting, while driving us forward and guiding us down the critical path. When we arrive in the lower part of the central room, we'll find that the big chest that was teasing us is actually locked, another first in the series, forcing us to find the big key before we can open it. The same goes for the northern door. So while the room here appears and feels open with those branching paths, we only have one way to actually go, through the right side door. This takes us into the lower part of this room and into this dark room, which is a loop with 2 doors. One is locked, so we have to take a minor detour through the other to find the key, just like we did earlier in the castle. The path then crosses over the orb room from earlier and into this room, which has a combat-centric puzzle challenge, after which we'll find the big key. We're looped through that one-way path and back to the central room. Now we can open that big chest for the dungeon item, the bow, which will be needed up ahead. We can open that northern door now, and there's one more fork in the road, with the right room being entirely optional. It's just cash. The left path takes us down a series of room-specific challenges, which will put our new bow to use, having us fight our way through these baddies, most notably the red Igors, all the way up to the boss room. So we've got that balance I mentioned earlier of explorable open space earlier in the dungeon, and now a linear gauntlet of challenges. And unlike the castle sewers, which were the same concept, I don't feel as much like this section overstays its welcome. It may pose a serious challenge to new players, especially as a kid I always found the Igors super intimidating, but for returning players it is a breeze to power through with that bow. With all of that out of the way, we have one more challenge ahead of us, the dungeon boss. Entering the boss room, we'll immediately encounter 6 statues which come to life before our eyes. These are the Armos Knights. In essence, 6 tougher versions of the Armos enemies found outside, and they'll serve as our first boss battle. They aren't too hard, but offer a fair challenge as well as having 2 distinct phases of the battle. The only other time that we've actually seen that so far in the series was with Rebonak in Zelda 2, and even then it was not done nearly as well as here. The first phase will have us battling it out with the group as a whole. You can use your sword or bow to fend them off and inflict damage as the group moves about in a variety of formations around the room. Your sword will work, but the bow is far more effective and will allow you to keep a safe distance from them. The second phase begins when only one is left. It doesn't matter which one, and they will change tactics. They'll turn red and attempt to stomp on you, so you've got to pull this sort of cat and mouse tactic, constantly pulling back, striking, and then carefully dodging. Unlike the first phase with the group as a whole, now he'll aim far more deliberately for you, rather than just moving about in formations. So while you probably won't get overwhelmed, you have to be far more cautious and stay moving. I like this. The boss goes from somewhat passive to growing in aggression. It's good stuff. Plus, the overall size and scope of the battle is pretty fun. They aren't the biggest or most imposing boss in the game, but they do the job well enough. Once they're defeated, we'll receive our heart container as usual, and the Pendant of Courage, and can return to Sahasrahla, and we'll get some swanky new Pegasus boots as a reward. And after some more exposition, we'll be on our way. So that's the dungeon. Overall, the Eastern Palace is a good and fair step up the difficulty curve from Hyrule Castle, while still feeling like a good starter dungeon. Not a tutorial, but a test of your skill, while reinforcing to us the ideas established earlier, and introducing to us a handful of new enemies and mechanics. It all feels dangerous and adventurous. Another improvement over the castle is that this time around, the dungeon item actually feels like it matters, as it should, since its placement here feels like such a deliberate focal point of the dungeon design. The bow is needed to defeat harder enemies, in particular those red Igors, as well as making other enemies and the boss much easier. I complained that the boomerang wasn't well integrated into the level design of the castle, so it's great to see them work that in nicely here. I think there is still room for improvement though. It gates you from defeating those red Igors, sure, but there aren't any memorable puzzles that put it to use. Besides, you won't even encounter any of those red guys until after getting the bow. It is still mandatory for progression, as there are some sealed doors ahead of where you found it that will only open if you kill said Igors. But it would have been nice to see some actual dungeon mechanic or puzzle that requires it, even if it was just shooting a switch or something. Still though, the sense of navigation through this dungeon is stellar. Whoever came up with this floor floor plan was brilliant. It's leagues ahead of the first two games and a great follow-up to the castle. That sense of interconnectivity as the rooms connect, loop, and overlap keeps things constantly feeling interesting to explore. They have just the right amount of branching paths, dead ends, and little teases to keep you moving through this place, and the challenges scale really gracefully. For example, the first encounter with an Igor is in the central room, where they can be easily ignored and avoided. Then we have to fight one later to get the big key, but he can be killed easily with a throw-in pot. Then we have a room with two of them, and the pots are not so accessible, so we have to carefully use either the bow or sword. Then a room with three of them, then one harder red one, and then a pair. The first time we encounter any Stalfos can be in either of these two rooms depending on which path you take. Both rooms have fewer of them in a wider open space. Lots of room to operate and get used to fighting them. Then it's in a smaller room, and then it's in the dark. You get the idea. Each time you're forced to fight a new type of tougher enemy, they pace it out nicely. This also applies for obstacles and traps, such as these orbs, which first must be avoided in this hallway, which has some great spacing and nooks to hide in. Then the concept is revisited in this room, which is much more chaotic, where we have to activate a floor switch to open the door. So overall, the Eastern Palace shouldn't be too hard to get through, but it feels like the dungeon is training you in a way. The game has already taught you how to fight and navigate in the castle, so now it's making you apply those skills, and introducing you to a greater variety of enemy types, which all behave very differently, all while incorporating more detours and branching paths, then capping it all off with the game's first boss battle. While I find the Armos Knights to be not a particularly amazing fight, they serve their purpose well enough. The rest of the dungeon feels so well thought out though that I just can't help but love this place. Thank you so much for watching this video. Before we end this off, I just wanted to take a moment to say thank you to my patrons and channel members, including, but not limited to, Greymage, Brenda, Tetra, Callie, Gail, Hylian Wes, Justin, Clifford Longhead, Midnight Naomi, and Bunny. Thank you all so much for the support and for watching, and I will catch you all next time. Bye-bye!